The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, smelling of cedar smoke and something faintly like gunpowder. And the moment Oscar Wallace read the words written in his cousin Eli's cramped, hurried hand, he set down his coffee cup, walked to the corner of his small bunkhouse in Abilene, Kansas, and began pulling his best saddle down from the peg on the wall. Eli had written from a little cattle town called Red Rock Crossing, nestled in the hill country of Texas, about 140 miles north of San Antonio. The letter was 3 pages long, but the sentence that mattered, the sentence that lodged itself somewhere behind Oscar's sternum like a spur catching in soft leather, was right there at the bottom of the second page. She is described by her father and by most every man who has tried to court her as fierce and unmanageable Oscar, and I am telling you this not as a warning, but because I suspect you are exactly the kind of fool who would consider it an invitation. Eli was not wrong. Oscar Wallace was 27 years old in the spring of 1878. He stood a few inches over 6 feet, had dark brown hair that curled at the back of his neck when it grew too long, and had the kind of hands that were calloused and scarred from a decade of honest work on other men's ranches. He was not a man of great wealth or great reputation. He owned his horse, a blue roan gelding named Calhoun, his saddle, which was hand-tooled and worth more than everything else he owned combined, a good rifle, a serviceable pistol, and a bedroll that had seen better years. He had been working on the Benton cattle spread outside Abilene for going on 3 years, and he had been saving his wages slowly and steadily, with no particular plan in mind beyond the vague and persistent feeling that he was meant to be somewhere else doing something more than pushing other men's cattle from one side of a pasture to the other. His cousin Eli had gone to Red Rock Crossing the previous autumn to help a rancher named Franklin Prescott get his new cattle operation started. Franklin Prescott, according to Eli's earlier letters, was a widower, a serious man in his late 50s who had come to Texas from Georgia after the war with enough money left to buy land and enough determination to make something of it. He had built a respectable ranch called the Cornerstone, and he was now looking to expand, which meant he needed more hands, more horses, and Eli had written with characteristic bluntness, a son-in-law who could eventually take the whole thing over because Franklin's health was not what it had been, and his only child, his daughter Theresa, had made it abundantly clear to every man in 3 counties that she had no interest in marrying any of them. The letter went on to describe Theresa Prescott in the particular way that men who are slightly afraid of a woman tend to describe her, all qualifications and hedging and nervous praise wrapped around a core of genuine bewilderment. She was 23 years old. She ran the daily operations of the Cornerstone Ranch with a competence that embarrassed most of the men who worked there. She could ride as well as any of the cowboys on the payroll, could read a cattle market report better than her father, had a temper that arrived fast and departed slow, and had, in the past 2 years, rejected 4 separate proposals of marriage from men her father had considered suitable, one of them by throwing a bucket of well water over the man's head and informing him that she would rather marry the bucket. Eli wrote that Franklin Prescott had recently confided in him that he was running out of ideas. He was not going to force his daughter to marry anyone, he had said, because he was not that kind of man, and because he was fairly certain that even if he tried, Theresa would simply refuse to cooperate. And Theresa refusing to cooperate was something that Franklin Prescott had learned, over 23 years of parenthood, to treat with the same respect one treated a loaded firearm pointed in your direction. But he was worried about her. He was worried about what would happen to her and to the Cornerstone when he was gone, because the land was growing more valuable and more contested every year, and a woman alone, even a capable and fierce one, would have a harder road than he liked to think about. Eli had written the letter, he admitted at the end, because he thought Oscar Wallace might be different. Not because Oscar was some exceptional prize, he was careful to note, but because Oscar was the only man Eli had ever known who, Upon hearing that something was difficult or dangerous or against all reasonable advice, did not become cautious but instead became curious. And because, Eli added, Oscar needed something to work toward, and he had been drifting long enough. Oscar read the letter twice. He set it on the small wooden table beside his bunk. He drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold. He sat for perhaps 10 minutes looking at the far wall of the bunkhouse, where a calendar with a picture of the Missouri River hung slightly crooked on a nail. Then he stood up, took down his saddle, and began checking the stitching on the fenders with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had already made up his mind, and was simply giving his hands something to do while his heart caught up with his decision. His bunkmate, a weathered old hand named Pete Garza, came in while Oscar was packing his saddlebags and watched him for a long, silent moment. Pete had been working cattle in Kansas and Texas since before Oscar was born and had the face of a man who had seen most things at least twice and been surprised by very few of them. "Where are you going?" Pete asked. "Texas," Oscar said. "What is in Texas?" Oscar paused with a folded shirt in his hands and thought about how to answer that honestly. "A woman who threw a bucket of water at a man who tried to propose to her," he finally said. Pete stared at him for a moment. "And you think that is a recommendation?" "I think it is the most interesting thing I have heard in 3 years," Oscar said, and tucked the shirt into the saddlebag. Pete shook his head slowly and sat down on the edge of his bunk. "You are going to go down there and she is going to make you miserable," he said, but there was something almost fond in his voice, the way you speak to someone who is about to do something you privately wish you had the courage to do yourself. "Maybe," Oscar said. "But I have been comfortable for 3 years, and it has not done me a damn bit of good." He left before anyone could talk him out of it. He went to see Benton that morning, thanked the man for the work, collected the wages he was owed, and by noon he was on Calhoun's back with the hill country of Texas somewhere ahead of him and the flat plains of Kansas falling away behind. And the spring wind was coming up warm from the south, smelling like new grass and distant rain. And Oscar Wallace felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, like he was riding towards something instead of simply moving through the days. The ride to Red Rock Crossing took him 5 days, because he did not push Calhoun harder than was good for the horse, and because he stopped 1 full day in a small town called Clearwater to have Calhoun reshod, and to give himself time to think about what exactly he was going to say when he arrived. He had no real plan. He was not coming to court Theresa Prescott in any formal sense. He was coming to meet her, which he acknowledged was perhaps the same thing but felt less presumptuous when he framed it that way. He was coming to help his cousin Eli with the spring cattle work, which was a true and legitimate reason to be there. Whatever happened beyond that would depend entirely on the woman herself, and Oscar had enough sense to understand that. He thought about her on those long riding days, the flat land giving way slowly to rolling hills, the scrub oak and cedar beginning to appear along the creek beds, the sky in Texas always seeming larger and more dramatic than the sky anywhere else. He thought about what it meant to be described as fierce and unmanageable by the people who were supposed to know you best. He thought that fierce could mean a great many things, most of them admirable, and that unmanageable was almost always the word people used when they meant that a person refused to be controlled, which was not a flaw he had ever been able to take seriously as a flaw. He had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri with a mother who was called difficult by everyone who could not keep up with her, and he had loved her unreservedly for every sharp edge and unyielding corner of her character. She had died when he was 19, and the grief of it had taken years to work its way down into something he could carry without it showing, and he thought sometimes that what he was really looking for, in all his years of moving and working and not quite settling, was someone who reminded him of her in the essential thing, which was the quality of being fully and uncompromisingly herself. Red Rock Crossing announced itself first as a line of cottonwood trees along a wide, shallow creek, and then as the smell of wood smoke and horses, and then as a cluster of low buildings arranged along a single main street that was wider than it needed to be and rutted deep from the winter rains. It was a town of perhaps 200 people, with a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a hotel of sorts, a small church built from river limestone, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings spreading back from the main street in the haphazard way of towns that had grown faster than anyone had planned for. Oscar found Eli at the livery, doing exactly what Eli always seemed to be doing, which was arguing good-naturedly with someone about the best way to do a thing. In this case, the argument was with the livery's owner, a heavy-set man named Rourke, about the proper angle for trimming a horse's hoof. Oscar dismounted, handed Calhoun's reins to a boy who materialized from the shadows of the stable, and waited until Eli noticed him. Eli Hartley was 30 years old, compact and quick-moving, with the sun-darkened face and perpetual squint of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. He looked at Oscar for a full second with the expression of a man who has written a letter and is now confronting the consequence of having written it, and then he grinned in the wide, uncomplicated way that Oscar had known since they were boys together in Missouri. "You actually came," Eli said. "Did you think I would not?" Oscar asked. "I thought there was maybe a 40% chance," Eli admitted. "Pete wrote to tell me you were on your way." "Pete cannot write," Oscar said. "He told me I was going to be made miserable." "He is probably right," Eli said and clapped Oscar on the shoulder. "Come on. I will buy you a meal and tell you what you are riding into." Over plates of beans and cornbread in the back room of the general store, where the owner's wife ran a kind of informal eating establishment for the ranch hands who came to town, Eli gave Oscar the full picture of the Prescott situation. Franklin Prescott was 61 years old, and his heart had been giving him trouble since the previous winter. He was still a capable man, and he managed the business affairs of the Cornerstone with his usual precision. But the physical work of the ranch had fallen more and more to Theresa over the past year, and she had taken it up without complaint, which everyone agreed was admirable, though nobody seemed entirely comfortable with the fact of it. The Cornerstone ran about 800 head of longhorn cattle on 4,000 acres of hill country land, which was good grass country, spring-fed, and less drought-prone than the flatlands to the west. They had a bunkhouse with 6 permanent hands and took on seasonal help for the drives. They had a good remuda, solid fences, and a reputation for honest dealing that was worth something in the community. Franklin had built it carefully over 15 years, and it was, by any reasonable measure, a success. Theresa had grown up on it, learned every inch of it, and loved it with the particular intensity of someone who knows that love alone is not a guarantee of anything. She had watched her father's health decline and had absorbed the responsibility without being asked to, and had, in the process, become something that did not fit neatly into any of the categories the people around her were comfortable with. She was not the gentle rancher's daughter waiting to be chosen. She was not trying to be a man. She was simply herself, which was a person who knew cattle and horses and land in numbers, who had opinions and expressed them, who did not believe that competence should be apologized for, and who had found, in her 23 years on Earth, precisely 0 men who seemed to understand that none of these things were problems requiring solutions. "The 4 men who proposed," Oscar said. "What were they like?" Eli leaned back in his chair and considered. "The first one, Henderson, was a decent enough fellow, but he told her straight out that she would not need to worry about the ranch business any more once they were married, because he would handle all of it." She thanked him for his concern and showed him the door. The second one, a man from San Antonio named Croft, was richer and older, and she just flat out said no before he could even finish asking. The third one proposed at a church supper in front of about 40 people, which she considered an ambush and responded to accordingly by standing up, explaining calmly and in considerable detail why the answer was no, and then sitting back down and finishing her pie. "The fourth one is the one who got the bucket of water." "What did that one do wrong?" Oscar asked. He told her father first, Eli said. Went to Franklin for permission without saying a word to Theresa. She found out from the cook who overheard the conversation, and by the time the man came to speak to her she was already done with him before he opened his mouth. Oscar was quiet for a moment. None of them asked her what she wanted, he said. That would be the central problem, yes, Eli said, and looked at his cousin with the careful attention of a man recalibrating his estimate of something. You should also know, he added, that Theresa knows you are coming. Her father mentioned it. Oscar felt a particular kind of stillness settle over him. And what did she say? Eli's expression shifted into something caught between amusement and sympathy. She said, and I am quoting here because I was in the room, she said, tell him not to bother unless he can handle being told no, because I will not be cruel about it, but I will not be dishonest either. Oscar sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. That is fair, he said. Eli looked at him again with that recalibrating expression. Most men would find that discouraging, he said. I am not most men, Oscar said. And she did not say no. She said she would not lie about it. That is not the same thing. The Cornerstone Ranch was 3 miles south of town, along a creek road that wound through cedar and live oak, and Oscar rode out to it the following morning with Eli in the buckboard, officially to deliver some supplies and unofficially to begin what Oscar was choosing not to call a courtship, and what he had no other word for. The gate was made from cedar posts with a simple iron latch, and beyond it the road opened up into a wide clearing where the main house stood, built from the same pale limestone as the church in town, with a covered porch running its full length and bougainvillea beginning to crawl up the southern corner of it, the red-orange flowers bright against the pale stone in the morning light. Franklin Prescott came down off the porch to meet them, and Oscar saw immediately what Eli had meant about his health. The man was still substantial in the shoulders and carried himself with the dignity of someone who had worked hard and built something real, but there was a grayness under his coloring and a careful quality to his movements that spoke of a body being conserved. He had gray hair and sharp blue eyes, and he looked at Oscar with an expression that was measuring without being unkind. Oscar Wallace, Franklin said, and put out his hand. Mr. Prescott, Oscar said, and shook it. The older man's grip was still firm. Eli tells me good things about you, Franklin said. Come in. I will have Maria put on coffee. The inside of the main house was clean and practical, with good heavy furniture and a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A woman in her 50s named Maria, who cooked and kept the house, appeared with coffee, and then disappeared with the tact of someone who understood when a conversation was not meant for her. Oscar was looking at the room, at the bookshelf along one wall where volumes stood alongside a set of cattle record books, at the rifle above the mantel, at the window that looked out toward the barn and corrals, when Franklin said, My daughter is out with the horses. She will be in shortly. No rush, Oscar said. Franklin sat down across from him and looked at him steadily. I will be direct with you, Mr. Wallace, because I have never found any other approach to be worth the time. I am not looking for someone to take my daughter off my hands. She is not a problem to be solved, and I will not have her treated that way. What I am looking for, if I am looking for anything at all, is someone who might be worthy of her, which I will tell you honestly is a high bar. I expect it is, Oscar said. She is aware you are here and why. I told her the truth, which is that you are Eli's cousin, a decent worker, and a man who did not seem bothered by the description she carries. She had opinions about that. What kind of opinions? Franklin allowed a small, dry smile. She said that a man who is not bothered by her reputation either has not heard enough of it or is arrogant enough to think he can change her. She said to tell you that she is not going to change. Oscar looked at the window, at the line of the corrals beyond it, and said, With respect, Mr. Prescott, please tell her I am not here to change anything. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then why are you here? It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer. Oscar turned it over for a second and then said, Because I have been drifting for about 3 years and I have been looking without knowing what I was looking for. And when Eli wrote me that letter, I read the description of your daughter and I thought, that sounds like someone worth writing 140 miles to meet. Not to change, just to meet. Franklin looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. The door opened. Theresa Prescott came in from outside, and Oscar stood, which was automatic and polite. And then he simply looked at her for a moment the way you look at something that is more than you expected it to be. She was tall for a woman, and built in the way that years of physical work build a person, which is to say strong and efficient, and without any particular concern for how that strength was regarded. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, and she wore it pinned up but with pieces of it escaping down around her face because she had been working and had not stopped to attend to her appearance before coming inside. She had dark eyes that looked at him directly, which was one of the first things he noticed, that she looked at him the same way he looked at things he was sizing up, which was frankly and without apology. She had her father's sharpness in the set of her face and her mother's something else, something warmer and more complicated in the curve of her mouth. She was, in short, exactly as advertised and nothing like what he had managed to picture on the road down from Kansas. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and her voice was clear and level. "Miss Prescott," he said, "Oscar is fine." She glanced at her father, who was watching the two of them with the careful expression of a man who has planted a seed and is not sure yet whether the ground was right for it. Then she looked back at Oscar. "Eli says you are a decent hand with horses," she said. "I get along with most horses," Oscar said. "We have one who is not getting along with anyone at the moment," she said. "A 3-year-old done with opinions. If you want to be useful while you are here, you can start with him." It was not a welcome exactly. It was more like a proposition, and Oscar recognized it for what it was, which was a test, offered openly and without pretense, and he appreciated it enormously. "Point me at him," Oscar said. That afternoon, in the round corral behind the main barn, Oscar spent 3 hours with a dun horse that Theresa called Copper on account of the reddish tinge in his coat when the sunlight caught it right. Copper was 17 hands of bad temper and unresolved distrust, a horse that had been mishandled at some point early in his life, and had built a wall around himself that expressed itself as sudden explosive movement, and the whites of his eyes appearing at the slightest provocation. Most men would have gone to the corral with a rope and the intention of imposing their will on the situation. Oscar went with a halter looped over his shoulder and his hands empty, and spent the first 45 minutes simply being in the corral, moving around the edges, letting the horse track him, doing nothing in particular until the horse's breathing slowed and his ears, which had been pinned flat with suspicion, began to flick forward with something closer to curiosity. He was aware, in the way you are aware of things happening at the edge of your attention, that Theresa was watching from the fence. He did not look at her. He kept his attention on the horse because the horse deserved it and because he was not performing for anyone. He was doing what he did with difficult things, which was to approach them slowly and with patience and to offer consistency in place of force. It was a method his mother had taught him, though she had applied it to people more than horses, and he had found over the years that it worked on both. By the time the shadows of the live oaks were stretching long across the corral, Copper was standing still while Oscar stroked his neck, and Oscar could feel the trembling in the horse's muscles, the enormous effort of choosing to trust, and he thought with a sudden clarity that he understood exactly how the horse felt. He became aware that the fence was empty. When he came out of the corral and walked back toward the barn, Theresa was inside checking the feet on a bay mare, and she looked up at him as he came in. "That took less time than I thought," she said. "He just needed someone to stand still long enough," Oscar said. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, dark eyes. "Most men walk in there with a rope and a theory," she said. "I have found that ropes and theories are the second resort," he said. "The first one is patience." She was quiet for a moment, then went back to the mare's foot. "Supper is at 6, she said. "Maria sets an extra plate." He took that for what it was, which was an invitation, and said, "Thank you." Supper at the Cornerstone that first evening was the three of them, Oscar and Theresa and Franklin, with Maria serving from the kitchen and Eli having already ridden back to town for his own bunkhouse arrangements. The food was simple and good: beans and salt pork and cornbread, and a pie made from dried apples that must have been laid up since the fall. The conversation was careful at first, as conversations between people who are deciding what to make of each other tend to be. But Franklin asked Oscar about his years in Kansas, and Oscar talked about the work there honestly, without embellishing and without false modesty. And the conversation opened up gradually, the way rooms do when the windows are let up on a warm day. Theresa did not say much during the meal, but she listened in the particular way that people who are actually interested listen, which is differently from people who are waiting for their turn to speak. She asked one question, which was about the Benton operation outside Abilene, what the market access was like there versus the rail connections further east, and the question was precise and informed, and Oscar answered it the same way, and he saw something shift in her expression, not warmth exactly, not yet, but a relaxation of something guarded, a door not opening but perhaps unlocking. After supper, when Franklin had excused himself with the careful dignity of a man conserving his strength for the next day's demands, Theresa went out to the porch with a cup of coffee, and Oscar, after a moment's consideration, followed. The evening was warm and still, the sky going from orange to purple to the deep blue of full dusk, and the first stars appearing over the line of the hills to the east. Somewhere down by the creek a night-bird was calling. "You can sit," she said, not looking at him, looking at the hills. He sat in the other porch chair, and they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way that people are sometimes quiet together before they have earned the right to it, as if the silence itself was a kind of audition for something larger. "My father told you about the men who proposed," she said. "It was not quite a question." "Eli told me," he said. "I am not here to propose to you, Miss Prescott." She looked at him then with a slight shift of her head. "Then what are you here for, honestly?" "Honestly," he said, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and the coffee cup between his hands, looking at the darkening hills the same way she was. "I read Eli's letter, and I thought about what he wrote about you, the fierce and unmanageable parts, and I thought it sounded like someone I would want to know. Not marry, not manage, no. And the ranch needs hands in the spring, and I needed somewhere to be. So here I am." The night-bird called again down by the creek. "That is either the most honest thing a man has ever said to me or the most carefully constructed," she said. "It is honest," he said. "I am not clever enough to construct things carefully." She made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. "Eli said you are steady," she said. "That is his word for you, steady." "That is a reasonable word for me," Oscar said. "I have had steady men propose to me," she said. "Steady is not enough on its own." "No," he agreed. "I expect it is not." They sat in silence a while longer, and when she went in she said, "Breakfast is at 5:30, which was both a dismissal and a confirmation that he was expected to be there in the morning, and Oscar walked to the bunkhouse with the feeling of a man who has made a very small amount of progress in the right direction and is content to leave it at that for the night. The next 2 weeks were a study in the particular pleasure of work done well in good country. Oscar fell into the rhythm of the Cornerstone with the ease of a man who has spent his adult life on ranches and knows the language of them. The early mornings with coffee and the day's tasks laid out, the long hours in the saddle checking fence and moving cattle, the specific camaraderie of the bunkhouse where men do not speak much, but communicate everything through the small gestures of cooperation and mutual respect. He worked alongside Theresa more often than not because she worked everywhere, moving through the operation with the authority of someone who had earned it honestly. And he observed, without making it obvious that he was observing, the way the hands related to her, which was with a kind of careful respect that was different from the respect they gave Franklin, and not entirely unlike the respect they gave each other. There was a hand named Bert, who was the eldest of the permanent crew at perhaps 45, who had worked for Franklin Prescott for 10 years and who, Oscar sensed, had appointed himself a kind of unofficial protector of Theresa's dignity, though she would have found that designation both unnecessary and probably irritating. Bert watched Oscar for the first few days with the specific attention of a man waiting to see how a new element would behave in a system he cared about. Oscar worked hard and spoke plainly and did not try to assume any authority that was not his and did not offer Theresa his unsolicited opinions on how she was managing things. And after about a week Bert said one morning while they were mending a stretch of fence together, "You are not like the others." "Which others?" Oscar asked. "The ones who came to look her over," Bert said. "You actually look at the cattle." Oscar hammered a staple into the fence post and straightened up. "The cattle are what I was hired for," he said. "The others were not interested in what they were hired for," Bert said, and that was all he said about it. On a Thursday, about 10 days into his time at the Cornerstone, Theresa and Oscar rode out together to check on a small herd of cattle that had been moved to the far pasture near the South Creek. And the ride out was 3 miles through cedar country that was fragrant with the particular sharp green smell of new growth after a spring rain. They talked about practical things, the condition of the pasture grass, the prospect for summer rain based on the creek levels, the quality of the current season's calves, and it was comfortable, the conversation of two people who speak the same professional language and who have discovered that this is a foundation of a kind. It was on the way back that something shifted. They had stopped to let the horses drink at the crossing, and Theresa was looking downstream to where the creek curved around a stand of cypress trees, and the light was falling through the leaves in the particular gold-green way it does in cedar country in late spring, and she said, quietly and without particular preamble, "My mother is buried on the far side of that cypress stand. My father brought her out here from Georgia, and she loved this land." She said Texas made her feel like the world was bigger than she had been told. Oscar looked at the cypress stand and said nothing for a moment, because the statement did not require a response so much as a witness, and he offered what he could of the latter. "She died when I was 14, Theresa continued. "And after that I had my father and the ranch, and I learned everything there was to learn about it because it was hers, and it was the only piece of her I could keep working. Does that sound strange?" "No," Oscar said. "It sounds like love." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, which was open in a way her face was not usually open. She had defenses of long standing, and they were earned defenses, and he had not tried to breach them, had simply waited, and now one of them opened of its own accord, and what he saw behind it was not weakness but depth, the kind of depth that only comes from having carried large things for a long time. "The men who proposed," she said, "they all wanted the ranch as much as they wanted me. They wanted the land and the cattle and the future value of it, and they wanted a woman who would manage the household and produce children and not trouble them with opinions. I could see it in all of them within the first conversation." She paused. "Can you tell me, honestly, that you are different?" Oscar looked at the creek. The horses were still drinking, unhurried. A kingfisher flashed blue and orange from a branch and was gone. "I want this land," he said. "I will be honest about that. I ride through it and it does something to me that the Kansas flatlands never did. There is something in this hill country that feels right to me, and I want work that is mine, so I would be lying if I said the ranch meant nothing." He turned to look at her directly. "But I want the ranch for what it is, not for what it gives me access to. And what I want to access," he said and held her gaze, "is the woman who already runs it, not to take it from her, not to run it instead of her, with her." The silence after that was different from the previous silences. It had weight and texture. "You say the right things," she said, and her voice was careful. "I am aware of that concern," he said. "I expect I will have to prove the saying and the meaning are the same thing. That is going to take longer than 2 weeks. She looked at him for a long moment, and then the corner of her mouth turned upward, not the almost laugh from the porch, but a real one, small and reluctant and entirely genuine. "No," she said. "It is going to take considerably longer than 2 weeks." They rode back to the ranch in the long gold light of late afternoon, and Oscar felt the spring wind on his face and the solid rhythm of Calhoun beneath him, and thought that he would take as long as it required. Franklin Prescott had what he called a spell in the 3rd week of May, which was what he termed the episodes where his heart behaved in ways it was not supposed to, beating too fast and then irregularly, and then settling back with a kind of grudging capitulation to normalcy. He did not tell Oscar about it. He told Theresa, because she would notice anyway and because he could not lie to her even when lying would have been kinder. Oscar found out because he came into the kitchen at the wrong moment and saw Theresa's face when she thought she was alone, which was a face stripped of its competent, composed exterior and showing what was underneath, which was fear, not panic but fear, the sustained and daily fear of someone watching something they love move toward an inevitable horizon. He said nothing then. Later, when they were checking the horses in the evening and she had the composed face back in place, he said, "Eli told me about your father's heart. If there is anything I can do, extra work or errands in town or anything at all, you only have to say." She kept her hands busy with the curry brush, working it along the bay mare's flank. "He is managing," she said. "I know," Oscar said. "I'm not asking because he is not managing. I'm asking because you are managing all of it, and that is a heavy thing to carry." She stopped brushing and stood still for a moment with her hand resting on the mare's side. "Most people assume that because I am capable I do not need anything," she said. "Capable people need things as much as anyone else," he said. "They are just better at not showing it." She looked at him over the mare's back with an expression that was complicated and honest, and he held it without looking away. And what passed between them in that moment was not romantic in any conventional sense, but was intimate in a way that made romance look like a smaller thing, which was the recognition of being seen. "Thank you," she said. And that was all. But it was enough. June came in hot and gold, the way it does in Texas hill country, the grass bleaching from green to amber on the upland pastures, and the creek bottom staying cool and shaded. Oscar had extended his stay at the Cornerstone in the manner of someone for whom the extension was not a decision, so much as an acknowledgment that leaving had ceased to be a thing he considered. He was earning his place on the payroll, and Bert had stopped watching him with assessment and started watching him with something closer to satisfaction. And Eli, who rode out from town twice a week, observed the whole situation with the quiet pleasure of a man whose impulsive letter had turned out to be a good idea after all. Theresa and Oscar had developed the particular language of two people who spend long working days together and are building, slowly and carefully, the vocabulary of each other. He knew that she took her coffee without sugar and that she was better in the mornings than the evenings, which was to say more forthcoming, less guarded, before the day's complications had had a chance to accumulate. He knew that she loved the cattle operation with a depth that was almost abstract, not the individual animals but the whole complex system of it, the ecology of grassland and market and weather and management that produced something from nothing over and over again. He knew that she read, which was not unusual, but what she read was, which was everything, history and agriculture, and whatever newspapers and journals she could get from the store in town, and that she had opinions on the cattle drives and the rail markets and the Texas land policies, and the treatment of the remaining Comanche communities who had been pushed onto the reservation at Fort Sill just 3 years earlier, an injustice she spoke about with a quiet and sustained anger that he respected enormously. She was learning him too, he knew, in the way she paused sometimes before speaking to him as if she was consulting something she had been building, a catalog of his qualities and their reliabilities. The day he kissed her, he had not planned it. They were coming back from the south pasture at dusk. the sky turning that specific color of burnt copper that the Texas sky does in the summer evenings, and they had stopped on a rise above the creek where you could see the whole length of the valley that the cornerstone occupied, the pale limestone of the house gleaming in the last light, the corrals and barns arranged below it, the cattle visible in the lower meadow as small dark shapes against the amber grass. Theresa had her hands on the saddle horn and was looking at it with the expression she had when she was loving something she was also worried about, which was most of the time, and Oscar was looking at her. "I am glad I came," he said. She turned to look at him, and something in his expression or his voice must have communicated something that she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for, because she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I am glad you came too. I did not expect to be." "I know," he said. "I noticed." She made a sound that was a real laugh this time, unguarded and genuine, and the last light caught it and her face in the same moment, and Oscar leaned from his saddle and she leaned from hers, the two horses standing patient and close, and he kissed her gently, briefly, with the full awareness that this was a threshold, and that what mattered was not the kissing but the fact that she kissed him back. She pulled back and looked at him with those direct dark eyes that showed everything to someone who knew how to read them, which he was beginning to know how to do, and she said, "Do not make me regret that. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time ensuring you do not," he said. She looked at him for another moment and then turned her horse and started back down the slope toward home, and he followed, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening. But the silence had changed its quality entirely. What followed in the weeks after was the slow and deliberate process of two people who have been cautious for good reasons allowing themselves to become less cautious, which did not happen all at once and was not a smooth or simple process. There were days when Theresa pulled back into her competent and controlled self, not coldly but protectively, the instinct of someone who has learned that vulnerability has a cost. And Oscar on those days did not push but stayed near, kept working, kept showing up with the same consistent quality that Pete Garza and Abilene had described as steady, and that was, Oscar knew, not a passive thing, but an active commitment to not disappearing when things became uncertain. There were evenings on the porch when she talked about her mother, about the years of learning the ranch, about the particular isolation of being a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and found that the world had very few structures prepared to accommodate her. There were moments of sharp humor that Oscar found delightful because they were intelligent and they arrived without warning, and moments of serious pragmatism that he found equally appealing because they were rooted in reality rather than fantasy. He told her things, too, about Missouri, about his mother and the quality of her toughness, about the years of drifting that he could now recognize as waiting, though he had not known what for, about the fact that he had never wanted someone else's life, had never envied the Bentons and their acreage or the big operators in Kansas, had wanted something that was built jointly, from nothing or near nothing, into something that meant what it was because two people had made it that way together. She listened to all of it the way she did everything, which was seriously and without rushing to conclusions. In July, 3 things happened that mattered. The first was that Franklin Prescott had a worse episode with his heart and Dr. Hensley in Raydrock Crossing, a practical and competent man who had trained in Houston and who spoke plainly, told Franklin that he needed to reduce his workload substantially, and that the heart was managing, but that managing was not the same as recovering, and that at some point the managing would cease. Franklin came home from that appointment and sat on the porch for an hour without speaking, and then he called Theresa in and told her everything, because he was that kind of man, and Oscar, who happened to be working near the house, watched Theresa come out of that conversation with her father with a stillness that was not peace but resolution, the kind that comes from deciding that you are going to face a thing fully and without flinching. That evening she sat next to Oscar on the porch steps instead of in the chairs, which was different and meant something, and she said, "He is not going to get better. Not really." "I know," Oscar said. I am going to keep running this ranch, she said. When he is gone, I'm not going to sell it and I'm not going to let anyone take it from me. I want you to understand that before anything goes further between us. I understand it, Oscar said. I have never thought any different. She looked at him for a long time in the evening light. Some men say the right things and mean something else entirely, she said. Yes, he said. I know you have reason to believe I might be one of them. I do not know how to prove otherwise except to keep saying the right thing and keep meaning it until enough time has passed that you believe me. That might take a while, she said. I have already told you I am patient, he said. And she laughed and leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat that way as the stars came out, and it was the first time she had initiated contact, and he held very still so as not to make her aware of the significance he was assigning to it, because he understood that to name a thing too soon was sometimes to make it retreat. The second thing that happened in July was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Garland Voss, who owned the land to the west of the cornerstone, and who had been, for the past year, letting his cattle drift across the fence line and graze Prescott grass, a thing that Franklin had tolerated in the spirit of neighborly flexibility, but that Theresa had been tracking in the cattle records and had become increasingly impatient with. Voss was the kind of man who had decided that Franklin's declining health presented an opportunity, and he appeared one afternoon at the gate with two of his hands, and a posture of casual entitlement that made Theresa's expression go flat in the way that Oscar had learned to recognize as a warning. The conversation was terse and unpleasant. Voss spoke primarily to Oscar, apparently deciding that he was the appropriate male authority to negotiate with, and Oscar let him talk for about 30 seconds before saying, in an entirely neutral tone, that he was hired help here and not the person Voss needed to speak to, which was the woman standing right there, and he gestured to Theresa with the complete absence of embarrassment and the complete presence of respect. Voss looked at Theresa with an expression that combined condescension and calculation in roughly equal parts. He made an offer to purchase the south pasture at below market value, framing it as a favor. Theresa told him the south pasture was not for sale at any price, cited the specific dates and estimates of the fence crossings she had recorded over the past 6 months, and informed him that she would be repairing the west fence line, and that any cattle found on Prescott land after the 1st of August would be held, and a fee charged for their return. Voss left dissatisfied, and after he was gone Bert, who had been standing by the barn during the whole exchange, said to no one in particular, "Lord Almighty," which Oscar took as an expression of admiration. Later, when they were alone, Theresa said, "Thank you for doing what you did." "Which part?" he asked. "Redirecting him to me," she said. "Most men would have handled it themselves and considered it a service." "You did not need me to handle it," he said. "You handled it considerably better than I would have." She looked at him with an expression that was warm and unguarded, and that he was coming to recognize as the face she showed him when she was not guarding anything, which was becoming more frequent. Did I not?" she said, and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that changes a room. The third thing that happened in July was that Oscar, on a Friday evening when the work was done, and the light was long and gold, and the porch was empty except for the two of them, and a jar of iced tea that Maria had left, and the nightbird was already starting down by the creek, said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want to be clear that I am asking you and only you, because it is only your answer that matters to me." Theresa set down her tea and looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to give up anything," he said. "Not the ranch, not your authority over it, not your opinions, not any part of yourself. I am not asking you to need me in the ways you do not need me. What I am asking is whether you might want what I want, which is to keep building this thing between us in the direction it is going, with the intention of arriving eventually somewhere permanent." He held her gaze. "I am asking if you would like to keep moving toward marrying me when you are ready and not before, and with the full knowledge that if you decide you are not ready, I will not disappear and I will not hold it against you." The night was very still. "That is the strangest proposal I have ever heard," she said. "It is not a proposal," he said. "It is a request to continue in the direction we are going." "The direction we are going leads to a proposal eventually," she said. "I would say yes to that," he said. She looked at the hills darkening to purple in the late dusk. "The men who proposed to me before," she said, "they made me feel like a transaction, a piece of land with a heartbeat." She paused. "You make me feel like a person who is being chosen. That is not a small thing." "No," he said, "it is not." She turned and looked at him fully, and what was in her face was not guarded now, not composed, not the fierce and self-contained woman that 3 counties had decided was unmanageable, but someone choosing, freely and deliberately, to open the door that she had kept shut for very good reasons for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "I want to keep moving in this direction." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him and held it back. August brought the full weight of Texas summer, the heat pressing down on everything by mid-morning and not relenting until well after dark, and the work did not stop for the heat but bent around it, with the harder physical tasks moved to the early hours and the late afternoon, and the midday spent in the shade of the barns or the porch, or the cool interior of the limestone house, where the thick walls kept the worst of it out. Oscar had long since stopped being a visiting hand and had become, by the consensus of everyone at the cornerstone, part of the essential machinery of the place. Franklin paid him good wages and did not comment on the evenings on the porch or the quality of the looks that had replaced the first careful measuring between his daughter and this man, who had ridden down from Kansas on nothing more than a letter and a hunch. Franklin Prescott said, one afternoon when Oscar was helping him with the accounts at the kitchen table while Theresa was out at the south pasture, "I am going to ask you directly." "Go ahead," Oscar said. "What are your intentions regarding my daughter?" "To marry her if she will have me when she is ready and not before." He looked up from the column of figures. "And to run this ranch with her as a partnership, with her as the senior partner. She knows it better than I do and she loves it more than I do, and that is the natural order of things." Franklin looked at him for a long while. "Her mother," he said finally, "was fierce. People called her difficult. She was the best person I ever knew and the only one who could call me on my nonsense without me resenting her for it. I built all of this for her, and she died before I could finish building it." He looked out the window at the hills. "Theresa is her mother's daughter in every way that matters." "I know," Oscar said. "Then you understand what you are taking on," Franklin said. "I understand what I am fortunate enough to be considered for," Oscar said. Franklin nodded once. "Good." In September, Theresa said yes to a real proposal. Oscar asked her on a Sunday, after church in town, standing beside the creek at the cypress stand where her mother was buried, which was right, which felt right to both of them. The air cool for the first time in months, the cypress already beginning to touch the edges of their autumn color. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple silver band that he had been carrying for 8 years, that his mother had pressed into his hand on the last day she was lucid and said only, "For when you find the right one," and which he had nearly given up on finding a purpose for. He held it out and asked her plainly, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession. Something that might have been tears in the vicinity of her eyes, though she contained them with the self-possession that was her way. And then she looked at him with the fully open face that she gave him now without guarding it, and she said yes. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it against her working hand, the ring on a hand that was calloused and capable and real, and she said, "It fits." "It was meant to," he said. She kissed him then, which was different from the kisses he had initiated, had more of something in it, more intention, more arrival, and he held her there in the cedar-scented autumn air beside the grave of her mother and the creek moving steadily over its limestone bed. And he thought that this was what Eli had really sent him toward, not just a woman but a life that fit the shape of him in all the right ways. They were married in October of 1878 in the limestone church in Redrock Crossing, on a Saturday when the hill country had turned to gold and amber, and the air carried the first real chill of autumn. Theresa wore a dress that Maria had helped her make, ivory-colored with small buttons down the back and her mother's lace worked into the collar, and she wore her hair pinned up properly for the occasion with small fall flowers tucked in at the side, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with her father's arm under hers and her head up and her eyes on Oscar, who was standing at the front in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and represented. He was aware, the full extent of his wardrobe. And she looked at him the way she looked at the ranch when it was beautiful, the way she looked at something she was choosing to love unreservedly, and Oscar Wallace stood there in that little limestone church and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. The ceremony was performed by the pastor, a young man named Whitfield who was earnest and kind, and spoke the words with genuine feeling. Eli stood up for Oscar, barely managing to contain the satisfaction of a man who had sent a letter and was now watching the result of it unfold in real time. Franklin Prescott sat in the front pew and wept in the quiet, contained way that proud fathers weep, holding himself together by the force of a lifetime's discipline and letting only the tears themselves show. Theresa said her vows clearly and without any of the conventional hesitation, looking directly at Oscar, and when she got to the promising part, her voice was steady and absolutely certain, and he thought that was the most romantic thing he had ever witnessed in his life. He said his vows back to her and added one that was not in the standard words, quietly just for her, that he intended to choose her every day for the rest of his life, not because he was obligated to, but because she was worth choosing, and her expression at that was the unguarded one, the fully open one, and she pressed her lips together for a moment and composed herself and then said, in a voice just as quiet, "And you." The wedding supper was held in the yard of the Cornerstone, which Maria and the cook from the hotel in town had dressed with cloth on the tables and lanterns hung in the live oak trees, and the whole community of Redrock Crossing came in the way that small communities come to the celebrations of their own, fully and generously, bringing food and goodwill, and the relief of an occasion that was simply joyful without complication. Eli drank more whiskey than was strictly advisable, and made a speech that was heartfelt and slightly rambling and entirely characteristic. Franklin danced with his daughter to the fiddle music that two of the ranch hands produced with more enthusiasm than precision, and the dancing went on until the stars were well overhead, and the night air was cold enough to see your breath, and Oscar danced with his wife more times than he danced with anyone else, and was not embarrassed about it. Theresa danced with the unself-conscious physical grace of someone who is comfortable in their body, and she laughed freely that night in a way that Oscar had come to understand as precious because it was not calculated, not performed, just the real thing, and he thought that the letter had said fierce and unmanageable, and it had been right, and it had also been entirely inadequate. They spent the first night of their marriage in the main house in the room that had been prepared for them, and in the intimacy of that first night, as husband and wife, what Oscar found was not what nervousness might have prepared him for, but something entirely natural and warm and tender, because what they had built over the months was a foundation of genuine knowing, and what they built on it now was easy in the way that things are easy when the ground has been properly prepared. In the morning they were still themselves, just in slightly altered relationship to each other and to the house, Theresa making her inspection of the corrals before the sun was fully up, and Oscar saddling Calhoun to ride with her, and Maria bringing coffee out to the porch, and saying nothing but smiling with the comfortable satisfaction of someone who has watched something difficult become something right. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a working one, as all winters on a working ranch are, but it was also the winter of settling in, of learning each other's domestic rhythms and discovering that they were compatible in the ways that mattered and willing to adjust in the ways that required it. They argued occasionally, because both of them had opinions and a belief in expressing them, and their arguments were real arguments rather than performance, which is to say they were occasionally heated and always honest and resolved by the application of the same mutual respect that animated everything else between them. Oscar had been honest about his own stubbornness, and Theresa had been honest about her tendency to treat an argument one as permanently settled, and they navigated both with the good humor of people who like each other enough to find their own flaws instructive rather than disqualifying. Franklin spent the winter in declining but stable health. Dr. Hensley came monthly and adjusted his recommendations accordingly, and Franklin managed the financial affairs of the ranch from his chair at the kitchen table with undiminished sharpness, while the physical work continued to fall to Theresa and Oscar and the crew. He had conversations with Oscar during those winter evenings that ranged widely, about the history of the land and the cattle market and the future of the Texas range, as the rail lines extended further, and the old long drives became less necessary. And Oscar listened carefully because Franklin was a man who had learned from 30 years of doing what Oscar was just beginning, and the information was worth more than any amount of formal schooling. "The men who tried to court her," Franklin said once in January, when the wind was blowing from the north and the cedar outside the window was bent against it. "They wanted what she was connected to. The land, the cattle, the value of the operation. You want the operation itself, that is the difference. She is the operation," Oscar said. "The rest is just land without her." Franklin was quiet for a long moment. "You are a better man than I gave you credit for when you rode in," he said. "I liked you from the first day, but I was not sure you were right for her. I am sure now." "I appreciate that," Oscar said. "For what it is worth, I think she would have been fine without me." "She would have," Franklin agreed. "But fine is not the same as happy, and she is happy now. That matters more to me than any of the rest of it." In March of 1879, Theresa told Oscar she was pregnant, and the way she told him was characteristically Theresa, which was to sit down across from him at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up and say, without preamble, "I am going to have a baby in September." Oscar set down his coffee very carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him with an expression that contained approximately equal parts of wonder and practical concern. "I am. I am healthy, and Maria says I have my mother's constitution. I will keep working as long as I am able." "Of course you will," he said. "I would not suggest otherwise." She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her expression softened into the warm and entirely unguarded thing that he thought of as the truest version of her face. "I know you would not," she said. He moved around the table and she stood, and he held her there in the morning quiet of the kitchen for a moment. Just that. Just the two of them and the warmth of the house and the sound of the wind in the cedar outside. And she put her forehead against his shoulder and breathed out slowly, and he thought this was it. This was the thing he had been riding toward when he was in Kansas with Pete Garza and a cold cup of coffee, and a letter with a sentence in it about a fierce and unmanageable woman. And it was better than anything he could have understood from the outside. She worked through the spring and into the summer, which nobody could have stopped her from doing anyway, and she worked sensibly, without pushing past what was reasonable. And Oscar worked alongside her with the specific attention of a man who is not trying to take over but is trying to be useful, which is a finer distinction than it sounds, and one that Theresa appreciated with the clarity of someone who had experienced the alternative. Franklin Prescott died in June of 1879, on a quiet Wednesday morning, in his own bed, in his own house, with Theresa holding his hand and the windows open to let in the smell of the cedar and the sound of the creek in the distance. He had said what he needed to say in the weeks before, to both of them, and he went without much struggle, which the doctor said was as much as could be hoped for, and which Theresa received with grief that was real and sustained, and which she did not minimize and did not dramatize, only carried with the same dignified directness that she brought to everything. Oscar buried him in the limestone earth beside his wife, under the cypress stand at the South Creek, and built the headstone marker himself from Good Hill Country rock. And Theresa stood at the grave with her hand in Oscar's and her head bowed, and said a private thing to her parents that Oscar did not listen to and would never ask about. In the days after, when the immediate task of grief was replaced by the longer task of its residue, the cornerstone continued. The crew was solid and loyal, and the work did not stop because death had visited. Because death visits working places and life goes on alongside it without dishonoring either. Oscar assumed more of the management while Theresa was in the final months of her pregnancy, not taking it from her but absorbing the physical parts of it, and she let him because she trusted him, and because she was wise enough to know that asking for help from someone who offers it freely is not weakness but good sense. In September, on a Tuesday morning when the hill country was just beginning its turn toward autumn and the air was almost cool, Theresa gave birth to a son. He arrived with the kind of vigorous indignation that healthy babies produce, and that Oscar, who had been in the yard outside the house working through sheer nervous energy, while Maria and a midwife from town attended to things inside, heard as the most welcome sound of his adult life. Maria appeared at the door with her face open and bright and said, "Mr. Wallace, come in now. They are both well." The boy was solid and red-faced and unquestionably present, and Theresa lay against the pillows with the specific exhausted radiance of a woman who has done a tremendous thing and is now holding the evidence of it. And she looked up at Oscar when he came in, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy and then at his wife and said nothing for a long moment because nothing he could say was adequate to the moment. "He looks like my father," Theresa said. "He looks strong," Oscar said. She looked at him with wet eyes that she was not bothering to manage. "Frank," she said, "after my father." "Frank Wallace," Oscar said, and the name sat perfectly in the room. Frank Wallace grew from a red-faced, indignant infant into an equally opinionated toddler with his mother's dark eyes and his father's tendency to approach unfamiliar things with curiosity rather than retreat, which became evident quite early, and which caused Oscar to feel a particular wordless gratitude whenever he observed it. The boy took his first steps in the main room of the Cornerstone house in the spring of 1880, and his first steps outside were, appropriately, toward the corral fence, which he reached and gripped with both hands and looked through at the horses with an expression of pure intent. "He is going to be trouble," Bert said from behind them. "Yes," Theresa said, with enormous satisfaction. In the spring of 1880, Theresa and Oscar had the conversation they had both been working toward for a year, which was about the future of the Cornerstone, about expanding the operation, about what the ranch was going to be in 10 years. They sat at the kitchen table with the cattle records and the land maps spread between them and talked for 3 hours, which was the length of time required to get from the beginning of the conversation to a place where they had made real decisions, not because they disagreed, but because they were both thorough and neither of them was willing to commit to a plan they had not examined from every direction. The plan they arrived at was to expand the herd by 40% over the next 3 years, to invest in improving the pasture on the north section which had been underutilized, and to hire 2 additional permanent hands, which Oscar would be responsible for selecting in consultation with Bert. They were also going to buy out Garland Voss on the western boundary. Voss had overextended himself over the previous winter and was quietly looking for someone to take the burden of his westernmost section off his hands. And Theresa had found out through the kind of information network that small communities provide to those who listen carefully. The land was good, and the price, when Oscar and Theresa went to Voss with their offer, was fair, and Voss accepted it. And when they rode out over the newly acquired pasture together that afternoon, Oscar said, "Your father would have appreciated this. He would have done it 6 years ago," she said, "if the opportunity had been there." "You are better at it than he was," Oscar said, not to flatter her but because it was the observation of someone who had studied both of them carefully. She looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "He built this ranch from nothing," she said. "And you are going to double it," he said. "That is not diminishing him, that is honoring him." She was quiet for a moment, looking across the new land, the cedar-covered hills running west to a line of distant blue. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." The years at the Cornerstone in the early 1880s were years of steady building, of work that accumulated into something larger than each day's individual effort, of the particular satisfaction that comes from building a life with someone who is fully present in it. The cattle operation grew as they had planned. The land was managed well, the water sources maintained, the fences kept up. Oscar developed a reputation in the community for fair dealing that extended the Cornerstone's reach at the cattle markets in San Antonio, and Theresa's knowledge of the markets and the breeding stock became known among the neighboring ranches, with the slow inevitability of genuine competence making itself evident over time. In the spring of 1882, Theresa was pregnant again, and this time she approached the whole thing with slightly less anxiety and slightly more of the wonder that the first time had been too complicated to access freely. The baby arrived in October, a daughter, and Theresa held her with the specific tenderness of a second-time parent who knows already what a gift this is. And Oscar sat beside her on the bed with Frank, who was 3 and deeply suspicious of this new development, and looked at his wife and the new child, and thought about the letter and the saddle and the road from Kansas and the distance between the man who had set down a coffee cup 3 years ago and the man sitting here now. And the distance was very great, and he had covered every inch of it without regret. They named her Clara, after Oscar's mother. Frank took approximately 3 weeks to decide that Clara was acceptable, and then became her fiercest and most devoted protector, which pleased Theresa enormously, and which Bert, now approaching 50 and increasingly philosophical about everything, observed with the dry approval of a man who had watched 2 people fall in love properly, and then build a family out of it and found the whole thing deeply satisfying. Eli Hartley, who had stayed in Raydrock Crossing after all and had eventually married a schoolteacher named Agnes, and was building his own quieter version of a life there, came to supper at the Cornerstone at least once a month, and was treated with the warmth due to a man who is responsible for something beautiful, which is to say he was teased relentlessly, and fed very well, and his opinion was solicited on everything important. "You sent the letter," Theresa said to him, one evening when Oscar had taken the children in for their baths, and she and Eli were on the porch with coffee and the autumn night coming in cool and sharp. "I should thank you." "You did not want him here at first," Eli said. "I did not want any of them," she said. "I wanted not to have to perform being manageable for someone who had already decided what I should be." She looked at the hills. "He never asked me to be manageable, he just asked me to be present. That is a different thing." Eli was quiet for a moment. "He packed his best saddle," he said, "before anyone could talk him out of it. That is a man who knows his own mind." "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what it is." In 1884, when Frank was 4 and Clara just past 2, Oscar rode out alone one afternoon to the cypress stand at the South Creek and stood for a moment at the graves of Franklin and Margaret Prescott and said, to the mild autumn air and the sound of the creek and whatever was in attendance, "I am taking good care of it, and of her. I want you to know that." The creek moved over its limestone bed with its perpetual unhurried sound, and the cypress leaves drifted down orange and gold into the water and moved away downstream, and Oscar stood there with his hat in his hands and felt the full weight and rightness of his life settle over him like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. When he came back to the house, Theresa was on the porch with the children and a pile of mending and the expression of someone who is exactly where they intended to be, and she looked up at him with the fully open face, the truest version of her, and said, "You were gone a long time. Where did you go?" "The South Creek," he said. She understood. He could see in her face that she understood. She nodded once. "Supper in an hour," she said. He sat down on the porch steps, and Frank immediately climbed over him with the total lack of ceremony of small children who have decided a person is furniture. And Clara brought him a handful of something that appeared to be gravel and presented it with immense pride. And Oscar accepted it with the same seriousness. And Theresa watched all of it from her chair with an expression that was everything. That was love and history and the future all at once. That was the face of a woman who had been called fierce and unmanageable, and had turned out to be those things, and also tender and loyal and deeply capable of love when someone came along who deserved to receive it. "You know," she said conversationally, watching Clara attempt to climb into Oscar's lap using a method that involved mostly his ear, "Eli told me what his letter said about me." Oscar looked up from the child-related negotiations. "Did he?" "He showed it to me last month," she said, "fierce and unmanageable." She said the words with a quality in her voice that he had come to recognize as private amusement. "My father said those things to him." "Your father loved you," Oscar said. "I know," she said. "But he did not know what to do with me." She looked at Oscar across the porch in the golden late-day light. "You did." "I did not try to do anything with you," he said. "No," she agreed. "That is exactly what I mean." Clara had achieved the lap by means that appeared to defy gravity, and was now rearranging Oscar's shirt buttons with professional focus. And Frank was sitting on the porch step beside his father with his father's same quality of sitting, which was quiet and grounded and taking in everything. And the evening light was turning the limestone of the house to pale gold and the cedar on the hills to shadow. And the night-bird that had been calling in that creek bottom since before Oscar arrived in Redrock Crossing was beginning its evening song again. The same one he had first heard from this porch on that first night when Theresa had said he could sit, and they had looked at the hills together, and the door between them had stood unlocked, and neither of them had yet turned the handle. The cornerstone grew over the following years into one of the finest operations in that part of the Texas Hill Country, known for good cattle, straight dealing, and the unusual circumstance of a woman who ran half of it, which was notable in 1884 and in 1886 and in 1888, and each year it was less remarkable, and eventually it was simply the way things were at the cornerstone, which was the best possible outcome. Theresa Prescott Wallace's name was known in the cattle markets in San Antonio and eventually in Austin, and when people asked about her they were told she was the kind of woman you did not easily forget, which was accurate, and that she ran her ranch as well as anyone in the county, which was also accurate, and that she had a husband who seemed perfectly content to be running it alongside her, which was a thing that some people found peculiar, and which Oscar Wallace found to be simply the most intelligent arrangement he had ever been part of. In the spring of 1887, they had another son, whom they named James, and James was born with something of his maternal grandmother's quality, which was a stillness that contained tremendous feeling, and he was a gentle child who loved the horses with a purity that reminded Oscar of himself at the same age, and Theresa watched her youngest with a soft and particular attention, recognizing something of her mother in him. The family grew. The ranch grew. The years accumulated the way good years do, with enough hardship to keep it real and enough joy to make the hardship worthwhile. A dry summer here, a difficult calving season there, a fence dispute resolved, a market downturn navigated, a child's fever sweated out through a long night, a birthday celebrated with pie that Maria made every year until she grew too old for the kitchen and was replaced by her niece, who had learned from her and was nearly as good. On their 10th wedding anniversary in October of 1888, Oscar and Theresa rode out at dusk to the rise above the South Creek where they had kissed for the first time, the hill country gone amber and gold and purple in the autumn evening, the cattle visible in the lower meadows, the lights of the house beginning to glow in the distance, and they sat their horses in the old comfortable way, side by side, and looked at it together. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. She looked at him with the unguarded face, the wide-open face that she had once kept so carefully closed and that now was simply her face when she was with him, because she had stopped guarding it from him a long time ago and did not remember precisely when and was glad of it. "Do you know what I thought the morning you first came to the ranch?" "What did you think?" he asked. "I thought he is going to be like the others," she said. "I thought he is going to look at me like I am a problem and try to present himself as the solution." "And when did you decide I was not like the others?" she considered. "The horse," she said. "Copper. I watched you in the round corral that first afternoon, and you just stood there with your hands empty and waited until he decided to trust you, and I thought, either this man is extraordinarily patient or he has no idea what he is doing. And then I thought, no, he knows exactly what he is doing, and I thought that was worth paying attention to." "Copper turned out well," Oscar said. "Copper turned out beautifully," she agreed. "He is still one of the best horses in this remuda." They were quiet for a moment in the way they had been quiet together since the beginning, which was a comfortable and communicative silence, a silence that held as much conversation as the words ever had. "I would like to grow old here," she said. "With you. I want to watch our children grow and see what they make of this land, and I want to sit on that porch when we are old and drink coffee and look at these hills." "That sounds exactly right to me," he said. She turned and looked at him with her whole face in the last light, and it was the face of 23 years old and 33 years old and every age between and beyond. It was fierce, and it was warm, and it was the face of a woman who had never been unmanageable, only uncontrollable, which is an entirely different thing, and Oscar Wallace, who had packed his best saddle and ridden south on nothing more than a letter and a feeling, and the particular stubbornness of a man who hears a door described as stuck and immediately wants to try the handle, looked at her across the 10 years and all the days and seasons in them, and thought that this was the shape of his life, finally and completely, and it was exactly the right shape. He reached over and she took his hand, and they held it the way they had been holding things together for a decade, easily and without thinking about it, as natural as breathing, as permanent as the limestone hills behind them and the cedar-scented air around them, and the South Creek moving steadily over its ancient bed far below, carrying everything and keeping nothing and making of its perpetual moving a sound that was, if you knew how to listen, very close to contentment. They rode back to the house in the gathering dark, and through the windows the lamplight was warm and gold, and from inside they could hear the children, the particular noise of a family in the evening, Frank's voice and Clara's answering and James's quieter presence beneath both, and Maria's niece calling something from the kitchen, and the sound of it was home in every sense of the word, built by two people from the particular materials of their own natures, fierce and patient, unmanageable and steady, which turned out to be exactly the right combination for making something that would last. Oscar unsaddled Calhoun in the barn, which he always did himself, and ran his hand along the old blue roan's neck in the affectionate way of long acquaintance, and Calhoun leaned into it with the comfortable trust of an animal that has been well cared for, and Oscar put up the saddle on its peg, the best saddle, the hand-tooled one that was worth more than everything else he had owned the day he packed it in Abilene. And he looked at it for a moment in the lamplight of the barn, with the particular feeling of a man reviewing the evidence of a good decision, and then he went inside to his family. The door of the cornerstone closed behind him, and the lamplight was steady in the windows, and the night bird began its song down in the creek bottom, and the hill country night settled in around the ranch with the unhurried permanence of things that are exactly where they are supposed to be.